Ronald Reagan, one of the most hawkish military presidents in American history, behind possibly George Bush, said to Menachem Begin during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, called him up specifically and said, you have to stop, this is a Holocaust. And he used the word specifically because globally, internationally, the image people saw about that conflict was a 7-year-old with its arms blown off. And he specifically used those words to the Israeli prime minister at the time to get him to stop the invasion. And what happened? 20 minutes later, not 20 minutes later after Reagan had phoned up Menachem Begin, they had said, I have spoken to Ariel Sharon and we are going to stop the incursion. That's how much power the American president has to stop Israel doing what it's doing. In fact, to the point at which Ronald Reagan remarked to his aides that he didn't realize that he had this much power to stop Israel doing what it was doing. And this just shows, given what's happened, when all it took was Stephen Witkoff going to Netanyahu and telling him to stop, that they have stopped. That was an option that was always on the table. It was always on the table for the Biden administration. They could have stopped this point blank whenever they wanted. Whenever they wanted, they could have stopped this. And they have chosen not to. They have chosen not to do this. So much for cementing Biden's legacy, having found a ceasefire agreement before the end of the presidency. He will only, and I mean only, be remembered for the man who let a genocide happen under his watch, with his money and with his weapons. And that will be his legacy forever.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that in terms of Biden's legacy. I mean, I'm actually sort of thinking about this a bit more skeptical of the idea that this was possible because finally there was sort of an American negotiator who was willing to stand up to the Israelis. I mean, everything we know about Donald Trump would suggest that that's a little bit implausible. And to me, it seems actually that this is more about the fact that Biden is leaving than the fact that sort of Trump has come here and has put his foot down, because Netanyahu does have an interest, right, in those hostages being released. That hasn't been his priority. His priority has been to make Gaza completely unlivable. But, you know, he does have this secondary desire, which is to have the hostages released because that lowers some of the pressure within Israel in terms of Israeli politics. And he's in a bit of a win-win here, because I think one of the reasons why he might not have wanted to do that sort of agreement and gone into a ceasefire is because then he thought he would have to begin negotiations with a Biden administration that at least wanted to hold up the pretense of humanitarian law. Obviously, they didn't really believe in it. Otherwise, they would have made Israel stick to it, and they didn't. But there would have been some sort of pretense that was we have to keep to liberal norms, etc. This, to me, feels like, you know, Netanyahu gets the hostages, but it's not going to be difficult for him to begin the war again in sort of just as an explicitly sort of genocidal fashion as he had beforehand, because Trump's going to be in office and Trump is going to say, yeah, go for it. So this, to me, seems like it could be a case of getting the hostages out and then continuing with the original plan, which was to clear out Gaza. It doesn't seem to me that we can be particularly confident that this is anything more than that, though that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least hope for that. Let's go to Daniel Levy for what he thinks on this. Daniel Levy, you'll have heard from many times on this show, former Israeli negotiator, now Middle East analyst. Daniel, how significant do you think this deal could be?
Well, look, Michael, in the very immediate, if it's finalized, and even more so if it's implemented, one hopes that means an end, or at least a pause, and we'll come back to that distinction, to the daily bombings and civilian casualties from those bombings in Gaza. It doesn't change the horrendous destruction and impossible humanitarian circumstances under which people are living. Of course, Israelis will get out some of those hostages. Israelis being held will get out. Palestinians who've been held in Israeli prisons, thousands of them, not all of them will get out at this stage, certainly. They were often held without trial. So those are really important things. However, there are big question marks over some of the details. There are big question marks whether one will move to a second phase. I just heard you saying there is the possibility, perhaps likelihood even, that this will be just the first phase and that there will be a return to the killing and the destruction. So that means a dynamic, everything must be done, and it may not be enough to create a dynamic which makes that as difficult as possible. And then you look at this, and anyone who's forward over the texts from several months ago and gets to see the text from today will notice how little difference there is. Tens of thousands of Palestinians, some of those hostages also, have died in the interregnum. So much destruction.
What's your assessment of why this has happened now? You know, there's one analysis sort of Trump is playing a bit harder than the Biden administration. Do you think that's what's happened?
Yeah, I did catch the end of your thought on that, and we're going to disagree a bit on this. So, Netanyahu did not want to get to this moment. His politics are much more difficult to manage under the new circumstances created by this deal. He has cabinet ministers who come out openly against it. He has some kind of rebellion in his coalition. Now, let's get from there to, okay, so what was the Trump role here? Did he put real threats on the table? And I think we will get a lot of speculation about what threats were issued and what promises were given by Trump. And I don't think that's the story. I think the story is Netanyahu's perception of how he would have to manage a Trump relationship as opposed to how he was able to manage a Biden relationship. And Trump could hit the ground running because Netanyahu was already nervous. Netanyahu knew that he could lead the Biden administration by the nose. Now he knows also that when it comes to Trump, this isn't going to be a pro-Palestinian rights administration. It's not like Netanyahu is going to go, oh no, you might force me to end apartheid, end the occupation. No, none of those things. But he can't be certain that Netanyahu, that his own personal political interests, and that's the driver here, that his own personal political interests will always be accommodated by an unpredictable Trump administration. And I do think that's been the key difference. People will say, oh, but, Trump won't be like that. He won't when it comes to the permissive environment for even greater violations of Palestinian rights. But he might be when it comes to, who are you, guy? I'm the president of the superpower. MAGA, not MIGA, not make Israel great again. I'm the superpower here. And for me, this is also the final and perhaps most damning indictment of the Biden administration. All that leverage, and they were so pathetic and they got rolled every single time. And people will say, wow, great, outgoing, incoming administration worked together to get this done. No. The Biden people would have had us here until Israel exclusively decided. Bibi did not want to face this dilemma, but this time he couldn't avoid it.
I mean, does he face a dilemma? I suppose that's what I find sort of somewhat confusing because, the deal seems to be written as, I mean, it hasn't been published, has it? But it just doesn't seem to me that it's going to be that difficult for him to get the hostages out, go through this 42-day thing and say, oh, well, there still isn't security in Gaza, so we're going to have to go back. Let's sort of finish what we started. What are the barriers to that just happening again and this all continuing in 42 days' time?
So I'm going to try and make the case that both can be correct. That had it have been the case that there was no risk entailed, he would have done this a long time ago. So on the one hand, Netanyahu, I think, is relatively confident that as long as he does just enough, if he wants to blame the other side, people are always in the West, in the US, certainly in the Trump administration, going to believe him, and you can go back to the devastation and destruction. But, and this is what's always made him nervous. Number one, the act of making a deal is already destabilizing to his coalition. And that's happening right now, Michael. That's the story of the last few days when it became clear that something new was afoot in Israeli politics. So number one, there's that. Number two, he doesn't want unpredictable dynamics, which he's not in total control of. And once this gets in motion, so first of all, you've got this question, the pressure from the families, which has really dissipated. But now when you see people coming out alive, as one imagines you will, then the families who aren't in that first phase will say, hell no, you can't stop now. And there will be more momentum behind that. You will see, perhaps, if the Western media, which hasn't done its job so far, the mainstream media, if they go in and show us, you may see things, you're likely to see things that the Israelis really wanted us not to see. you may see some of the ramping up of the humanitarian. So, and Trump may say, no, we're getting this done. It doesn't mean we can't do other things that you really want us to do. And you're already getting the talking points out of Trump. Because Netanyahu is saying to Trump, I need stuff to work with my public, with my coalition. So you can get all of that. But this adds, again, if you ask me to place a bet, he can and is more likely than not to go back to horrendous destruction there. But it is not nearly as controllable once you set off on this track, including his coalition. Also remember, by the way, he's got troops in Lebanon. He's still bombing Lebanon, despite the ceasefire agreement there. He's got troops in Syria. He's occupied part of Syria beyond the existing occupation of the Golan. They're bombing in Syria. You can do lots of bad things in the West Bank, and I haven't even mentioned Iran yet.
So I suppose how I'd been thinking about sort of Netanyahu's war aims in Gaza for a while, it seemed to me that sort of the war aim seemed to be, to clear people out from at least a significant part of Gaza, maybe the whole of Gaza ideally, but if that's not possible, at least some of it. And therefore sort of making sense of Israel's military actions seemed to be they're destroying the things that make life possible, infrastructure, homes, water supplies. And my sort of guess was that Netanyahu was waiting for Trump to come into power and saying, look, these people can't live here. This is unlivable. And Trump sort of bullying some neighboring countries into taking the Palestinians in Gaza as refugees. Does that sound plausible to you? And how would this ceasefire deal relate to those kind of war aims if they are what Netanyahu is thinking?
The one thing they're missing here is the future city of Gaza and the fact that Jared Kushner was there in April promoting waterfront real estate. So in reality, they have a ceasefire. Great. A permanent ceasefire? No. They have to go back in, continue to get rid of all these buildings and rebuild. Do you think they're going to rebuild for all of the Palestinians and to have this brand new future city, and the Palestinians are going to have free homes and get to live where they were and have been living for hundreds and hundreds of years? You're delusional if you think that's going to happen. No. This is a ploy. Make Trump look powerful, because he's coming in and Biden did a great job and he ended this war, they call it. It wasn't a war, it's genocide. It's ethnic cleansing. It's infanticide. It's amazing that people do not connect all the dots. And this ceasefire is a temporary ceasefire. It's rebooting, resupplying, so they can continue. But what comes next will shock the arrogance of the West if they keep pushing this genocide war. Now, it's a great thing that they're going to release thousands of these prisoners. Will they release them all? Remember, Trump's coming in 20th and then the 25th, he's the president of the United States. And by the time my birthday comes around on February 7th, the war will be up and running again, and we'll be back to the same game. This is the Conscious Hour. That's just my humble opinion of what's going to happen.